So good to be back with everybody today. Today is Thursday, August 28th. Here we are, getting very near the end of summer 2025, and it has been a strange and surreal and unexpected summer for me, and maybe a lot of us are feeling that way as well. But it has been a pleasure going through this material with you. All this time, we've been going for over a year now on this deep dive of the book of Numbers, and we've spent much of the summer with Numbers chapter 21. This week, we'll conclude Numbers chapter 21. We'll conclude our summer study because we'll take a little bit break for the high holidays and then resume in October. But so it seems like this is a nice we've reached a nice moment. It seems like a lot of things coming together. The chapter's coming to an end. The Torah portion, Chukat, is coming to an end at the end of this chapter, and we're drawing a close to the summer. And I've got some really, I think, just some wonderful material and fun material that I want to share with you today. And it's a little bit different than the Torah study that you and I are accustomed to doing together. I'll explain what I mean in just a moment. But let's take a look at Numbers 21 one more time and remind ourselves where we've been and what's brought us up to this point. Numbers 21, I know I keep saying this week in and week out, I think is in some ways my favorite chapter of the entire Torah because of all this delicious weirdness that is found in it. It it's well, look at where we've been. The chapter began. This is Israel arriving ultimately in the promised land, but a few episodes on their way as they're approaching the land of Israel from the east. The chapter began with this encounter with the Canaanites, where they were um, where the Israelites, well, it's the first of several encounters with aggressive enemies throughout this chapter. We read the first really bizarre passage about that copper snake that Moses was instructed to fashion that um, to ward off the attack of these poisonous snakes in the wilderness. And we're even told that that snake got put away and was held in the ark and ultimately in the Temple of Jerusalem for hundreds of years to come. That's the first sign of like this weird old time religion, this weird early mythology of Israel that is peeking between the cracks of this chapter, which is really what I want to talk about today. That's why I'm reminding us of it. But where else have we been? After we read about the copper snake, we read about the continuing journey through the eastern bank of the Jordan River and their encounter with various others as they made their way through the wilderness towards this destination. We read about the strange, mysterious Sefer Milchamot Adonai, the book of the wars of the Lord. Another clue that there's something kind of ancient going on in this passage. Well, ancient, I mean pre-biblical. There's a mythology that's peeking through the cracks in this chapter that preceded Israel and preceded the Bible. We have another book called the Book of the Wars of the Lord and a little clip of an itinerary that was described in that book. And then after that, the song of the well that Israel sang when the well of water came up in the desert wilderness and was able to nourish them. Last time we were together, we read about the battle against King Sihon of the Amorites. And again, after the battle with King Sihon, there was a little snippet of this mysterious song, a song that the bards would recite, not really about Israel at all, but about the Amorites and King Sihon and his legacy, which is really, really strange. Who are these bards? What is this song doing here? That's what we talked about the last time we were together. And then, if this isn't enough like mysterious mythological material in this chapter, today we're going to come upon the conclusion to the chapter, just 3 verses or so, of a battle with the mysterious King Og of Bashan. We're going to read that in just a minute. But before we do, I want to put this into context a little bit and why I want to say, again, our Torah study today is going to be a little bit different than what we're used to doing, you and I together. You've heard me talk in the past about what I've called, I really think this is going to be the title of a book that is really coming. Uh, you've heard me talk about the old weird Bible, how simmering beneath the surface of the biblical text, there are these ancient mythologies buried, long preceding Israel and the Torah itself. These little snippets of ancient mythologies, they appear in all five books of the Torah, and they appear even more dramatically in other books of the Hebrew Bible. The books of Isaiah, Samuel, Job, and the Psalms are all especially rich with this pre-Israelite kind of material. There's lots of books about this. One of the earliest, most pioneering was the work of Robert Graves and Raphael Patai, this book from the mid 20th century called Hebrew Myths, in which they explain that the wild polytheism of the past is suppressed in the Bible, but sometimes it leaks through in places with vestigial accounts of monsters, gods and goddesses, things that Israel replaced in the ancient Near East. This chapter, again, is so striking to me because it's one of those places where those editorial seams seem to be showing. And this remarkable chapter concludes on an appropriately mythological sort of note. We're going to talk about King Og today and his legacy. Um, it's just three verses at the end of Numbers, but as we'll see, it shows up other places in a little bit more detail. So first, these three verses at the end of Numbers chapter 21, which are on the screen here. A volunteer who would please, who would like to read these out loud for all of us? Go ahead. Who wants to read these? Gershom, please. I saw you.
Um, they marched they marched on and went up the road to Bashan, and Og, king of Bashan, with all his people, came out to Edrei to engage them in battle. But the Lord said to Moses, "Do not fear him, for I give him and all his people and his land into your hand. You shall do to him as you did to Sihon, king of the Amorites, who dwelt in Heshbon. They defeated him and his sons and all his people until no remnant was left him, and they took possession of his country."
That's it. And that's the note on which this amazing chapter ends. Now, if you never studied this before, if you weren't taught this in Hebrew school, if you've never heard of King Og of Bashan before, yeah, no problem. None of us, very few of us ever were. Like the stories from last time about King Sihon, this passage is not a widely taught, widely referenced passage from the Torah, not one that we teach our children on any sort of, you know, regular basis. And yet, one of the first points we made the last time we were together was once upon a time, in ancient times, this was clearly a well-known story. We know that because of all the many times in the Bible that they keep referencing, oh, and remember when Israel defeated King Og in the wilderness. It's mentioned in the book of Joshua, it's mentioned in Samuel, it's mentioned several times in the book of Psalms. It seems like for the ancients, the battle against King Og, which here only got three kind of straightforward verses, was much more deeply embedded in their memory. And that takes me to like really where I want us to go today. Let's let's put all our cards down and say this might not be the most spiritually uplifting story in the entire Torah. Okay, fair enough. That's fine. And you and I should be looking for spiritual uplift from the Torah. But the kind of countercultural point that I want to make is at least once upon a time, I'd like to suggest that the Torah was written down for other reasons as well, not just spiritual uplift. I mean, some of the reasons the Torah may have been written includes remembering the founding myths of the people of Israel. I mean, imagine in ancient times people sitting around telling stories about their history and where they came from, maybe around the campfire late at night. And some of the stories they told might have been about battles against mythological enemies who, in each retelling, get more and more threatening and surreal. This might seem a little bit irreverent in a way to approach the Torah, but it's also great fun. And I want you to go with me in this direction for a little bit because it gets kind of at the heart of the question, what is this mysterious book anyway that we call the Hebrew Bible? Why was it written? Why was it saved and preserved? Obviously, for spiritual and moral guidance, that's a primary directive of the Torah, but maybe it was preserved with some other intentions as well, and maybe it serves some other purposes. So we've got here this story that doesn't seem to have much spiritual uplift, but maybe there's some other juicy things we can discover about it as well. In fact, here it is again. Those three verses that Gershom just read for us. I think we don't need to spend too much time analyzing them because I want to show you something different about them, the way they're remembered. But let's see if there's anything that needs to be explained. They marched and went up the road to Bashan, and King Og of Bashan with all his people came out to Edrei to engage them in battle. Bashan, if you're following the story, the narrative of this chapter, Israel is moving gradually north on the eastern banks of the Jordan River. We're moving further and further north. Bashan is bordered at the top by the northern boundary by Mount Hermon. Who's been to Mount Hermon before? Gershom, you're not terribly far from Mount Hermon, just maybe 30 or 40 miles west, right?
Haven't actually been there, but I think I've seen it from a distance.
So that's the northern boundary of Bashan. That's the area that we're talking about, to the east of the Sea of Galilee, the Kinneret. Um, and then in verse 34, God says to Moses, don't fear this King Og, for I giving him and all his people and his land into your hand. You shall do to him as you did to Sihon, the Amorites who dwell in Heshbon, as we read about the last time we were together. One thing that's kind of different from the previous story is God doesn't instruct Moses in this way in the previous story. Now God sort of, this is the first time in a while that God has directly spoken to Moses and said, do this. I mean, maybe there's something to that, that this is different from the previous story because it's at God's behest. But ultimately, we don't get a lot of details about the battle or what happens. In just three verses, the whole story is dispensed with. They defeated him and his sons and all his people. No remnant was left of King Og, and they took possession of his country, yada, yada, yada. This is the classic yada, 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 by the way, because you and I are like, what? That's it? What's the rest of the story? What'd you even tell us that story for? And that's where I'll pause for a second and call upon John. John, what do you want to say about this?
What's different here is no words are expressed at all. In the prior
Mhm.
episodes, there's been a request to pass through the land, and there's been a refusal. Here, apparently, it's kind of like automatic. The Israelites come and Og comes out to fight them. And I think that's a little different.
So Manish Tana, why should the battle against King Og be different than those other battles? Ah, I'm glad you asked. Because now I'm gonna close this. One sec. There's other places where this story is remembered in a little more detail, even in the Torah itself. So if you've got the source sheet, I'm going to put it up on the screen, but I gave you the link in the chat to the source sheet that we're going to look at today. And in the book of Deuteronomy, this story, which it was only 3 verses in Numbers 21, in Deuteronomy, it gets 11 full verses, the description of what happens here. In Deuteronomy is written significantly later than Numbers, but it seems to be in the memory of the author of Deuteronomy. It gets a lot more detail. Check this out. Hey, Gershom, can I call upon you again? And I even put in a little ellipsis here to cut out all the details about the battle that ensued because there's a lot. It Deuteronomy describes in detail all of Og's lands and territories that were captured piece by piece by piece in the course of this ensuing war. But it's going to share a couple of other even more interesting details for you and me as well, I think. So, Gershom, read this, and then you guys tell me what details Deuteronomy adds to the story that Numbers didn't. Go ahead.
We made our way up the road toward Bashan. So it's first person. Okay, interesting.
Sure, because
And
of course, sorry for interrupting, but of course, Deuteronomy is couched in the language of Moses retelling the the exploits of the last 40 years of what we've done in the wilderness. So yeah, this is Moses talking. Go ahead.
uh, we made our way up the road toward Bashan, and King Og of Bashan, with all his men, took the field against us at Edrei. But God said to me, "Do not fear him, for I am delivering him and all his men and his country into your power, and you will do to him as you did to Sihon, king of the Amorites, who lived in Heshbon." So Yahweh our God also delivered into our power King Og of Bashan with all his men, and we dealt them such a blow that no survivors were left. Only King Og of Bashan was left of the remaining Rephaim. His bedstead, an iron bedstead, is now in Rabbah of the Ammonites. It is 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide by the standard cubit.
And again, the ellipsis there is about 8 or 9 verses of the conquest and details about the war, which I left out for us because
Yeah.
obvious question coming here, but what details does Deuteronomy add that Numbers conveniently left out? It's verse 11, right? That
Mhm.
wild verse. Look at it again.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, the details of King Og remaining, that wasn't there in Numbers, and certainly not his bedstead.
So we got a couple things we have to parse here. First of all, what does this mean? He was the last of the Rephaim.
Mm.
And then what's all this stuff about his bed? Bed, which is made of iron and happens to be 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. Should we dispense of the last part first? What's a cubit in biblical unit of measurement? Susan is showing us is typically the distance from the elbow to the tip of your middle finger. If we say that a cubit is approximately 1.5 feet, that means this iron bed that King Og slept in was 13.5 feet long by about 6 feet wide. So he was, if not an outright giant, he was of almost superhuman proportions. He was massive. And I wonder why Numbers left out this detail that Deuteronomy seems so eager to share with us with almost and with an enthusiasm that the translator gets by putting that exclamation mark in at the end. He was so big that he was 13 and a half feet long was the size of the bed that he slept in. You can hear the enthusiasm of the translator, right? So, okay, Deuteronomy has already shared a new detail with us that seems, in some ways, like the most exciting detail of the whole story. I mean, it's just another war, right? But here it's, oh, it was a war against a monstrous kind of creature, a giant that, if you're thinking of David and Goliath, you're not too far off. Carol, what do you want to say?
Well, so the name Og and Edrei, and certainly Rephaim,
Yeah.
all refer to being giants or being big or being really large. But particularly in Deuteronomy, as we get to Rephaim, it's a direct link back to the story of the scouts, which we read back in the beginning of Numbers
Uh-huh.
many months ago. Except there, God didn't tell us to go in, that we would take over the land and we would be okay. And here, God is saying, go ahead, go in, the land is yours, I will be with you. So these 38 years have passed, and we're now marching into the land. And now there are no scouts, and nobody is saying, no, we shouldn't go. You know, we look like grasshoppers to them. So it's sort of a direct contrast to, we didn't go into the land then, but we are now.
So that's a really exciting point. That this is a generation later, and the things that inhibited your parents from being able to go in and be successful, now I'm telling you, you don't need to be afraid of, right? You said that better than me, Carol. But that's a really nice point to make. And that word Rephaim, which Numbers, I have no idea why Numbers left it out. But here, Deuteronomy wants to really make this point to say, a generation later, don't be afraid of those things that held the previous generation back. That's a really good point. But Rephaim is an even older idea than Numbers chapter 13, as we will see in just a moment. Um, as we'll see in literally a moment, unless anybody has any other questions about this passage that's on the screen about Deuteronomy that you want to, or observations that you want to make. And then I'll show you what I want to do with the rest of our time together today is where this takes us in subsequent Jewish imagination. But Marcia, you were going to say something.
I think it's kind of a boastful look how powerful we are because we were able to this huge giant of a man. But is anybody else disturbed by all of this? I mean, you probably discussed it some other time, but just that we go into land and we meet people in battle and then we totally destroy them and take their land. Bother anybody else? It bothers me.
Well, I think for today's purpose, I'm not saying that you and I should draw. In fact, I'm explicitly saying we shouldn't draw moral lessons from this story. I'm trying to do something different today. I want you to kind of imagine our ancestors long ago telling stories about their past. And it's not so hard to imagine that our past, our arrival here today, came at the cost of I mean, for all of human history until about yesterday, part of national mythology was talking about great victories in battle. Why should ancient Israel be any different?
Okay.
Um, Susan, go ahead.
Maybe I have a dirty mind today, but either this guy is huge and needs the big bed, or who knows what's going on in his bed. You know,
Yes, you do
the
have a
bigger the bed, the more I
that
do have a dirty mind. Yes, the bigger
never would have
the
crossed
bed,
my
the more you
mind.
can. You're a better
Um,
person than I am. Okay.
but, but thanks for sharing, Susan. Uh, Deb.
Given that given that you pointed out that Deuteronomy is written much later than Numbers, and imagining, as you said, that these are the stories that were told to keep alive the memory of our history and how we came to be where we are in the time of Deuteronomy, is it possible that the story itself got exaggerated, and the reason that there's nothing about the size of the bed and the numbers of the land and everything in Numbers? His Numbers was being a little more straightforward about the historical record, and by the time of Deuteronomy, they've decided to remember all the details of all the towns, which in fact may have been there during the time of Deuteronomy. Maybe they weren't even there during the time of King Og. And also, he was so big. He was one of the giants that we heard about from the previous generation. So maybe there's a embellishment going on in the course of history of how the story gets told.
It is certainly possible. I just want to say that I don't know that it's true. Here's what I mean. It is certainly possible that stories got passed down, and as they got passed down, they got embellished and they snowballed and they gathered more and more preposterousness to them over the generations. That's definitely possible. But you also know, I know you know, Deb, that it's also possible that some of the mythology in the earlier texts got suppressed. And there were lots of stories about King Og that were told. Who's to say just because it got written down later that the story isn't still an ancient one? My suspicion is that ancient Israel had lots and lots of legends about an ancient enemy called King Og, and they told lots of stories about him. And I don't actually have any way of knowing which one's older or later. I know which one was written down older, sooner or later, but I don't know which one was actually told orally or older or earlier or later. My suspicion is that there was a lot of mythology about King Og. In fact, not a suspicion, I'm about to share some of it with you that got passed around. And for a long, long time, both preceding the Bible and long after the writing of the Bible as well. As I'm excited to share with you in just a moment. But first, Berna, who is sitting in the dark and in the quiet. Berna, can't hear you. Berna, 3, 2, 1. Berna, we will come back to you, I promise, when you can unmute. Gershom, you had one more thing to say?
Yeah, just a little bit off track, but it keeps jumping out to me as we're talking about this description of us coming through and decimating other people. I mean, possibly due to where I physically sit today in the land of Israel, where we get accused of being colonizers and invaders. In the modern era,
Yeah.
they haven't looked back at these stories where we really were the invaders. Although one can argue that we were returning here, but that we were at one time invaders, and that was probably a very normal thing of the time, that people moved and blasted their way through to get to where they were going. It's just an oddity that now we're still getting accused of it.
I just don't think that that's an accurate description what the narrative of the Bible is. I'm not denying that the Bible is violent, that there are moral problems with the conquest of the land, especially in the book of Joshua, but I'm not sure that's exactly what the narrative of the Bible is teaching either. I don't know. It's just
I'm not saying it's immoral. I'm saying it was probably normal for the time. It's not. One could say it's immoral to come
yeah,
out to the road and attack people who are trying to pass through. So it's just a whole different setting there, though.
Mhm.
Anyway, as I say, a little sidetracks. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. And let's talk, but obviously I want to talk about this mythology and the ways in which these stories are told. So with this word, where is it? He was the last of the remaining Rephaim. Rephaim is a mysterious word. You know, in modern Hebrew, Rephaim means ghosts. If you've ever gone down Emek Rephaim in Jerusalem, the Valley of the Ghosts. But and in the Bible, in some places, Rephaim, the reason Rephaim becomes ghosts in modern Hebrew is because in some places in the Bible, Rephaim are the people who live in the netherworld, the people who live in Sheol. But that's not what it means here. What it means here is there are one or two places in the Torah where the Rephaim are a mythic race giants, of giant enemies. They're mentioned in the book of Samuel, if you wanted to look that up. But and Carol mentioned before that they appear in Israel in Numbers chapter 13 when Israel was first approaching the promised land. But the first time the Rephaim appear in the Torah goes back earlier to Genesis chapter 14, to the story of Abraham. We're told that that in the time of Abraham, there was um, a group called the Rephaim who were living in this precise geographical place, in a place called Ashtarot, which is one of Og's cities near, in the north, uh, um, in the northeastern corner of the land of Israel. And Genesis 14 is a weird chapter. It's a chapter about Abraham that kind of presents a totally different picture of Abraham than we get from anywhere else. That chapter 14 is this self-contained chapter that's sometimes called the War of the Four against the Five. There was, in the time of Abraham, a battle of a certain group of enemies that confederated with one another that came into the land and they kidnapped Abraham's nephew Lot and stole him away. And then another group, another confederation of armies goes and fights back against those bad guys. It's not the most inspiring chapter of Genesis, but it's a weird chapter because nowhere else when we think of Abraham, we don't think of Abraham as a warrior, as a fighter. But in this one chapter, he's kind of presented this way. Anyway, the reason I'm telling you that is because it opens the door. When Rephaim are mentioned in Genesis, and Deuteronomy says only Og was left of the Rephaim, suddenly the door is open for some serious Midrash craziness. You ready? Rashi starts us off. Rashi says, when Deuteronomy says only Og was left of the remaining Rephaim, he's talking about the Rephaim from chapter 14 in Genesis, from Abraham's time. Abraham lived a long time ago. This is Moses, Deuteronomy is Moses and the Israelites 20 generations after Abraham. But Og escaped from battle. As it is written, a fugitive brought the news to Abraham the Hebrew. And this fugitive who brought Abraham the news about Lot's abduction was Og. So not only was Og a giant, but at this point he was 1,000 years old also. And suddenly the door to and Rashi, by the way, who says, my job is only to bring you the pshat, the plain sense of the meaning of what the Torah is telling us, suddenly opens the door to a whole mythological world that the Torah wasn't telling us about. Is it really possible that there were mythical giants from the time of Abraham still walking around the world at the time of Moses? Well, watch this. And this is what I want us to do together, at least for the next 20 minutes or so. I want to share with you some of the other stories that appear about Og, because Deuteronomy shared another story. But Rashi apparently had a different story. Rashi had a story that said Og goes back to the time of Abraham. And now let me show you some other things that people said about King Og. I went to my friend, Dr. Ellen Frankel, who is among other things, a great scholar of Jewish folklore. And she's got stories in her book, The Classic Tales, about King Og. Here's one of them. The giant Og, and she's not making these stories up, she's drawing on centuries upon centuries of Jewish literature. Listen to this. The giant Og was the son of Shamhazel, one of the fallen angels. When the great flood covered the earth, Og persuaded Noah to let him ride on the roof of the ark to feed him each day through a hole in the roof. In return for this favor, Og promised to serve Noah and his descendants forever. And later, Noah's descendant Nimrod gave Og, who had another name, which was Eliezer, to Abraham as a present when Abraham escaped the fiery furnace. Never in his life did Og use a wooden chair or bed, for he would have broken them with his huge body. Only iron chairs and beds could hold him. Daily the giant devoured 1,000 oxen or other animals and drank 1,000 measures of water or wine. Once when Abraham scolded him harshly, Og became so frightened that one of his teeth fell out, and Abraham made the tooth into an ivory bed for himself. ... Because it goes on for a bit more. Again, Dr. Frankel didn't make up this story. She drew on ancient sources. One of the sources she drew on is called the Targum Yonatan, which is a 2,000-year-old translation, but also interpretation of the Torah into Aramaic. So for at least 2,000 years, Jews were telling a story like this. You thought Og was old? He goes back to the time of before the time of Noah's Ark. And we have a story about him clinging on to the top of the ark. That's how he survived the flood. So he wasn't just a monster, he was a primeval monster from the dawn of creation. Here's a whole kind of category of literature of Judaism that we're frankly very rarely exposed to, I think. We tend not to tell one another today these stories, but for generations and generations, Judaism had a literature of mythological literature like this, where they told stories to one another about ancient heroes and villains. And why not? Why should Jews be different from every other civilization on the earth that told such stories? You like that one? I'll tell you another one. Or I'll ask somebody else. Hey, Susan Phillips, could you feel up to reading today? Because I know this is in your wheelhouse.
Yes.
Let's take a look at a story from Devarim Rabbah, which is the classic midrash on the book of Deuteronomy. That's just gonna, again, if you're looking for spiritual uplift, you might have to look elsewhere. But if you're looking for sort of a window into the soul of Jews from centuries ago and the stories they told, I think it's kind of exciting. Here's a story from Devarim Rabbah that I'll ask Susan to read for us. It starts with a verse that we know now.
We made our way up to the road toward Bashan, and King Og of Bashan with all his men took the field against us at Edrei. Moses and Israel arrived at the borders of Edrei. Moses said to them, "Let's encamp here, and in the morning we will enter the city." As they were about to enter, it was still dark out. Moses lifted his eyes and saw Og sitting upon the wall with his feet touching the ground. Moses exclaimed, "I can't believe my eyes. These people must have built an additional wall during the night." Whereupon God said, "Moses, what you see is Og." Rabbi Yochanan said his legs were 18 cubits long. Wait, how long was his bed?
13. He must have hung out. He must have overshadowed his bed and
w-
hung out long beyond it. Must have been very
way out,
comfortable
way
for him.
out.
No wonder
Because
he
it's,
was so no wonder he was in such a bad mood all the time.
yeah. Moses became frightened, but God said, "Do not fear, because I will make him fall before you. As it is written, do not fear him, for I am delivering him and all his men and his country into your power." Og then uprooted a mountain and threw it at Israel. But Moses took a stone and pronounced over it the divine name, and thus kept the mountain from falling. Israel exclaimed, "Cursed be the hands which would throw like this." And the Amorites answered, "Blessed be the hands which would uphold like this."
So here we have a story preserved in a classic Jewish text, not an obscure Jewish text, of Og as this kind of mythical monster, but also Moses as a mythical hero, not just the lawgiver and teacher of Israel, but also has someone who is like a superhero who also has this mystical incantation when he pronounces the name of God. When it says pronounced over it the divine name, that's a classic move in Jewish mystical literature because you and I aren't supposed to pronounce the name Yud Hey Vav Hey. Um, that acquires this kind of ineffable status. But in mystical stories, when somebody pronounces that name, it's in order to bring the power of God into the world. Most famously, when the rabbi, when the Maharal speaks that name and the golem comes to life. That's the idea of speaking the divine name. So what I'm getting excited about, what I'm sharing with you here is kind of times and places that have images of biblical heroes and villains that are so different, I think, from the stories that you and I tend to tell one another when we learn Torah together. Yes, Susan, go ahead.
All right, so if he's up on the wall, his feet are touching the ground, the wall isn't doing him any good, even if he were inside, right? His torso, I mean, you could just get him in the head. Am I being too literal? I'm sorry.
You're just in
And
a
then
different place than me because I can't analyze the story in that way.
um
I don't know. I
because
just
the
picture
other
Moses. The part of the story that makes me smile is when Moses wakes up in the morning and says, "Our enemies built a wall during the night." And a wall, picture the walls of Jerusalem. Picture a wall around a medieval city. They built a wall in the middle of the night. And they're like, Moses, that's not a wall. That's a guy.
so, so is everyone else shorter than he is?
Yeah,
Then
of
oh,
course. Of
so
course.
they can fit inside. They're safe within the walled city. Okay,
Listen,
I'm being too literal. Okay.
definitely. And if you take them too literally, you're going to miss part of the pleasure of the stories. Listen, I'll show you another one. This one's a little bit more famous because it's in the Talmud, so the Talmud's more famous. The Talmud is a great, among other things, a great receptacle of the mythology of Jews from long ago. There's lots of wild mythological stories in the Talmud, and they told stories about King Og also. Here's one. Okay, Susan, you want to read this one too?
Sure, sure.
Go ahead.
Regarding the rock that Og, king of Bashan, sought to throw upon
Remember, he
Israel.
wants to he wants to crush Israel with a stone, with a giant boulder. Okay, go ahead.
So it's huge.
Read,
Okay.
read. You'll see. You'll see.
We have a received tradition. Og said, "How large is the camp of Israel?" "It is 3 parasangs. I will go and uproot a mountain 3 parasangs long, and I will hurl it at them and kill them." He went and uprooted such a mountain and lifted it over his head. But the Holy and Blessed One brought grasshoppers upon it, and they pierced the peak of the mountain, and it fell on his neck. Og tried to remove it, but his teeth grew dramatically long to one side and the other, and he was unable to get it off. Thus it is written, you, you break the teeth of the wicked. And this is in accordance with the interpretation of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, who said, "What is the meaning of the verse, you break the teeth of the wicked?" don't read you break, but rather you lengthened. Then Moses, who himself was 10 cubits tall, took an axe that was 10 cubits long, jumped up 10 cubits, and struck Og in the ankle and killed him. Wait, why is he
Or
jumping to get
this
to the ankle?
listen, this memory was considered important enough to be preserved in the Talmud itself. This is not some fringy literature of ancient Jews. This is the Talmud, the you know the trying not to call it the New Testament of Jews, the fundamental book of rabbinic Judaism. And so what happened? We have a story here of King Og held a mountain over his head that he was going to crush the Israelites with. God sends grasshoppers, if that's grasshoppers that come and dig around it, and the mountain falls over Og's head and arms. Then he's like, well, if that's not comical enough, he says, well, I gotta get out of here. Now I'm stuck in this mountain around me. But God then extends his teeth like a walrus, extends long tusks coming down from his mouth so that he gets embedded, stuck in the mountain that's now surround him. Now King Og is trapped and stuck in this mountain, and Moses, who by the way was also 15 feet tall, got up and slays him. I'm not telling you. I have a great spiritual insight to share with you, to take into the days of awe about this story. What I'm telling you is somebody thought this story was so wonderful enough to retell that it even got preserved in volume of the Talmud here. And clearly, there is much, much more where this came from. Our ancestors, this might not be some great revelation, but our ancestor told stories upon stories that served many purposes. Some of them might have been for great spiritual uplift. Some of them might have been to explain the world around them and where they came from. And some of them might have just been simply for the joy of perpetuating Jewish storytelling and Jewish civilization. Judy, what do you think of this stuff? Are you enjoying this?
Oh, yeah, this is wonderful. Thank you so much. Um, but what I thought about, and Neil, you actually used the word comical, so that was where I was going
Mhm.
because in the modern, in our lifetimes, there's a whole lot of stuff about Jewish humor. You can read books about Jewish humor. I mean, there it is, and I think it's wonderful that it's just the power of humor being preserved. And then maybe that's one reason why it was so important because people valued humor as a way to cope with life. And um, anyway, it's wonderful. Thank you
That's
so much.
beautifully said, Judy. And you've been doing this with me for a long time. Humor is a topic I take very seriously. And,
Right.
you know, usually more around Purim time. But if you believe that our spiritual books, our spiritual literature, including the Torah, includes everything we need to navigate life,
Mhm.
then it would be a terrible omission if humor was missing.
Right.
So, of course, there's humor to be found in
Yeah.
the Torah and in sacred literature. If there wasn't, it would be it would be a glaring omission. But you said
And
it better, so I
yeah,
like the way you
just
did it.
one more thing about that, which is the aspect of humor contributing to the long-lasting nature of the story. The humor allows is part of what allows it to continue. I mean, aside from the fact that the Talmud decided to write it down, but the humor helps us continue it.
For sure. And not incidentally, if the primary purpose of the Torah and the Talmud and spiritual literature, if the primary purpose is to teach us, which I believe it is, you ever had a teacher who had no sense of humor? You probably have, but it's usually not good,
Right.
right? That any good teacher knows that humor is a fairly essential tool in their toolbox for teaching. Okay, Carol.
So we also have a midrash that says God went to all the peoples of the earth and asked them if they would accept the Torah, and they
Oh, it
all said
sounds like
no.
Og with the mountain, right?
So now God holds up the mountain over the Hebrews or the Israelites and says, "Will you accept my Torah?" And of course they said yes. They didn't want a mountain dropped on them. So now we have Og. How dare he do what God did? How can he possibly act like God? So therefore, that's not going to work. And not only that, but we were grasshoppers in the story of the scouts. We were so tiny, we couldn't do anything. And now we are the grasshoppers who destroy the mountain that Og is holding, so that that mountain's going to fall apart right on Og. So it's a beautiful midrash going back to other midrashim that we have. And I kind of love the story.
Me too. And thanks for making all those great connections. I do believe if my agenda today were to take just one text like that and really delve into it, we can make those connections. They are there to be made. You did it beautifully, Carol. Thank you. Cheryl, one more on this, and then I got one more thing to share with you before we're all done.
So, this thing came across my inbox today about like that you should give children books to read during the high holidays because services are boring. And Carol, I loved your adult reading of this story, which it's like the story, the Agadah, it's making me think in the Talmud works on two levels, which is the adults can hear it one way, but this is a really great story for kids. And I find myself telling my 4-year-old grandson, trying to tell him stories from the Talmud, and he's interested in those stories. I mean, he asked me, I was trying to tell him about the Kamsa and Bar Kamsa story, and he asked me what the name of the cow was, you know? So I think these are just really great stories. And that was also a function because, yeah, the if the primary purpose of the Torah is to teach us, we have to teach it.
Great.
Yeah.
Let me tell you, thank you for saying all that. Let me 12:55. Let me share you one or two more things and maybe make one final point. Um, there's other stories in the Talmud. There's a little snippet of one I put here at the top of page 4 about the rabbis, stumbling into these giant tunnels and discovering that they're in the skeleton of King Og. Those things those things happen sometimes to the rabbis in the Talmud too, but I'll take you to a more contemporary one, lest you think that these stories ended in, in the era of classical Judaism. They don't. They keep going. Of course, we still tell stories to one another too, and as you know. But one of the great scholars of Jewish folklore and storytelling today is Howard Schwartz. Penina Shram is kind of the preeminent Jewish storyteller of our generation, and together with Howard Schwartz, who has done a lot of scholarship on this, but the book that is a really marvelous book, if you know this one, is Tree of Souls, the Mythology of Judaism, from which I took this last selection from. And this is a scholarly book, the way folklorists are able to categorize and uh, the way they're able to categorize stories into different modes, into different styles, and so on. But this, if you're enjoying this topic today, the next place to go is Schwartz's Mythology of Judaism, which opens up windows into a whole world of Jewish literature that most of us never really knew existed. Here's a story that he's got the scholarly apparatus that goes with this story about where he found it and where he cites it and stuff like that. But he also retells these stories in a pleasing way. He's also going to tell us that if you think Og only existed in times of Noah or Abraham or Moses, or whatever, you got another thing coming. Because actually, Og, kind of like other mythic examples in Judaism, I'm thinking of Serach Bat Asher, I'm thinking of Lilith and some others, they kind of have a way of recurring and reappearing. Here he's going to take Og into the shtetl. I'll read it. Some say that Og managed to survive. And in his wanderings, he came to Poland in the winter. Not used to such cold weather, Og looked for a tailor, and when he found one, he demanded that the tailor make him a coat to keep him warm. He asked the terrified tailor how long it would take to make the coat, and the tailor, seeing the size of the giant, said it would take about a week. Og got angry and said if the coat wasn't ready in a week, he would trample the town to dust. The frightened tailor gathered all the people of the town together and told them of the giant's demand. So the inhabitants scurried off to neighboring towns and brought back every tailor they could find. An army of tailors then set to work on the giant coat, finishing just in time. Suddenly they heard the giant approach. With nowhere else to hide, they jumped inside the pockets of the coat. Og picked up the coat, put it on, placed his hands in the pockets to keep warm, squeezing all the tailors together. Then, warm for the first time since coming to Poland, after all, he was from Bashan, it's much warmer there. Warm for the first time since coming to Poland, Og lay down to sleep, and the terrified tailors escaped. But thereafter, every one of them had a pale face, and that is why Jewish tailors have pale faces. As for Og, some say he is still wandering the earth. And it's that last line that I like, because it brings me back to the campfire and picturing Jews telling stories about stories that have accumulated over the course of millennia, telling stories to one another. And any good campfire scary story has to end with a line like that. And some say he's still wandering the earth, or even standing right behind you. Listen, in these final moments that we have together, the reason why I wanted to share all this stuff today, I know this is different from the normal sort of Torah study that we do together, where we say, what's the moral meaning that I'm supposed to derive from the text? How is this supposed to inform the life that I lead? I believe all of that. That is what I try to do, as you know, 90% of the time when we study Torah together. But I've been thinking about, again, what is this book that we have? And among the many things that the Bible is, it's many things. First and foremost, it's instruction and it's theology. What is our experience with God? And provocatively, maybe you know Abraham Joshua Heschel's phrase, we think the Bible is human beings doing theology. Heschel said, no, that's not what the Bible is. The Bible is God's anthropology, God trying to figure out what people are. My point is the Bible is lots of things. And one of the things it might be is a reminder of the pleasures of Jewish culture and civilization, the stories that we pass down to one another and tell and retell to one another, because our stories make up who we are and we carry them in our DNA. And I think there is the simple pleasure of Jewish culture and civilization that is also something that we need in our generation, very importantly, to grasp and enhance and reclaim for one another. So that's why I wanted to share this with you today. It also seems like a nice siyum to our study together that we've been doing. This is, I think, our 39th class on the Book of Numbers. Some of you have been doing this with me from the beginning, and I'm so grateful. Some of you just joined us recently in this summer, and I'm so grateful. I hope you'll keep coming back in the fall. We're going to take a little bit of break for the fall holidays. We'll come back in October. But thanks so much, everybody, for your constant support and for being here. And I look forward to all the learning that we're going to do together this fall and, God willing, into the future. Thanks, everyone. That's what I got for you today.
Thank you.
Good class, Neil. Thanks, Neil.
Shana Tova to everyone.
Thank you, Neil.